Everyone thinks they know what a family holiday looks like. A table too full, voices overlapping, food passed hand to hand with practiced smiles. That afternoon, Thanksgiving arrived wrapped in exactly that picture. My son Caleb leaned toward me with a grin that felt rehearsed, his voice warm enough to disarm suspicion, and he said he'd made something just for me. The room paused in that subtle way people do when they're watching without admitting it. I remember the weight of my fork, the way instinct stirred before reason could catch up. What no one saw, what no one ever notices in moments like these, is how a single quiet choice can change the direction of an entire evening. Before I continue, I want to say this. If stories about family, intuition, and the quiet strength that comes from listening to yourself resonate with you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. These stories reach the people who need them because of that simple gesture. Now let me tell you what really happened. Thanksgiving at Caleb and his wife Marissa's house was always carefully staged. Marissa liked things to look effortless, which meant nothing ever truly was. The centerpiece was arranged hours in advance, the candles lit only once everyone was seated, the music low enough to suggest warmth without encouraging conversation to linger too long in one place. I arrived early as I usually did, not because they asked, but because it had become expected. A leaner will help, a leaner doesn't mind, a leaner knows where everything goes. I took off my coat, folded it neatly, and hung it by the door, already stepping into a role that no one questioned anymore. Caleb greeted me with a hug that was just a second too quick. He smelled like cologne he only wore when company was over. Marissa followed, smiling, touching my arm lightly as if to guide me further into the house, already speaking about the oven temperature and the timing of the sides. Lily was at the table, pretending not to listen while listening to everything, her eyes flicking up now and then with that quiet awareness only teenagers who feel out of place seem to develop. She smiled at me, a real one, the kind that doesn't check itself in the mirror first. The meal came together the way it always did. Plates passed, chairs scraped, small talk floated from one end of the table to the other. I noticed Caleb watching more than eating. He kept glancing at me, then at Marissa, then back again, like someone waiting for a cue. When he reached for the gravy boat, his hand lingered a fraction longer than necessary. "Mom," he said, voice bright, "you have to try this. I made it myself. Thought of you when I did." There it was, that smile, too polished, too eager. It didn't match the years I'd spent watching him barely notice what anyone ate, least of all me. I looked down at my plate. The gravy was darker than usual, thicker, settling heavily against the turkey. It looked fine, smelled fine. That's what unsettled me most. Experience teaches you that danger rarely announces itself. Marissa laughed at something someone else said, her attention pointedly elsewhere, but her posture was alert, angled just enough to keep me in her peripheral vision. The room felt tight, like everyone was leaning inward without moving. I don't know how long passed before I acted. Seconds, maybe less. Long enough for Lily to meet my eyes and then quickly look away, as if she'd sensed something too but didn't know what to do with it. I reached out, steady, and shifted my plate slightly, exchanging it with the one beside me while conversation carried on. It was a small movement, the kind people make absent-mindedly all the time. No one commented. No one stopped talking, except Caleb. His smile faltered just for an instant. "No, Mom," he said, a little too quickly, "that one was yours." I had already taken a bite of the mashed potatoes, nodding as if nothing at all had changed. "It's fine," I said, and I meant more than the food. The next half hour unfolded like any other Thanksgiving, at least on the surface. People ate, laughed, complained about being too full. Then Marissa went quiet. She shifted in her chair, pressing a hand to her stomach, color draining from her face in uneven patches. She excused herself once, then again. By the third time, the laughter had thinned. When she returned, she was pale, breathing shallowly, insisting she just needed air. Caleb was on his feet now, concern sharp enough to cut through the room. Someone suggested calling for help. Someone else fetched water. Lily sat frozen, eyes wide, watching the adults scramble. I stayed where I was. My hands rested in my lap, warm, steady. I felt nothing unusual. No tightness in my chest, no dizziness, no nausea. Just clarity, settling like dust after something has been disturbed. When the ambulance lights flashed through the front windows, painting the walls in red and white, I understood exactly why Caleb had smiled the way he did earlier. And I understood why my instinct had spoken louder than politeness. After they left, the house felt hollow. Dishes sat half-finished, chairs pushed back awkwardly. No one asked how I felt. No one remembered whose plate had been whose. I cleaned quietly, rinsing forks, stacking plates, moving through the kitchen like a guest who knew it was time to leave things better than she found them. The gravy boat was nearly empty. I poured what remained into a small jar and placed it in the refrigerator, tucked behind the cranberry sauce. Not out of anger, out of certainty. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table long after the house had gone silent, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, replaying moments I'd once dismissed as nothing. Caleb urging me to sign papers quickly. Marissa's gentle corrections that always seemed to diminish my say just a little more. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. I thought about how often concern can be used as a leash, how easily, for your own good, can become a way to move someone aside without resistance. My phone buzzed sometime after midnight. A message from Caleb, a status update. She's stable, no question mark, no warmth. I set the phone face down and stared at my hands. They didn't shake. That's when I realized the fear I'd expected never came. What came instead was resolve. If someone believes you are unaware, they will always underestimate you. That night, I decided I would no longer be underestimated. By morning, the house smelled faintly of leftovers and something sharper beneath it. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the street come back to life. The storm I'd sensed the night before hadn't broken yet, but I could feel the pressure building. I didn't know how far this would go or how ugly it might become. What I did know was simple. I had trusted my instincts and they had kept me standing. And once you recognize that quiet voice inside you for what it is, you don't ignore it again. Morning after Thanksgiving always carries a strange quiet, like the house itself is unsure whether it's allowed to move yet. I woke before dawn, not startled, not anxious, just alert. The kind of alertness that settles in when your mind has already made a decision your heart is still catching up to. The kitchen smelled faintly of roasted turkey and sage, but underneath it was something sharper, metallic almost, or maybe that was just awareness changing the way everything felt. I made coffee slowly, deliberately. I didn't rush the kettle or check my phone. For years, I had learned to move carefully around other people's moods, anticipating reactions before they happened. That morning, I let time move around me instead. When I finally picked up my phone, there were 2 messages from Caleb. Short, informational. No warmth, no curiosity about how I felt, no acknowledgement that I had been there, watching everything unfold. It confirmed what I already knew. Concern had never been the point. Control had. I dressed and drove home just after sunrise. The roads were quiet, the sky pale and clean. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt a strange sense of relief, like stepping back into a space that remembered who I was. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The chair by the window, the stack of mail, the coat rack I never bothered to straighten. I set my purse down and, without really thinking about it, went to the refrigerator. I opened it, reached behind the cranberry sauce, and took out the small jar. The gravy had settled overnight, separating slightly at the edges, still unremarkable, still innocent-looking. I didn't open it. I didn't smell it. I simply put it on the counter and sat down across from it, hands folded, studying it the way you might study a photograph after learning something new about the moment it captured. Objects don't change, but our understanding of them does. That jar wasn't proof yet, but it was a reminder. Something had been intended even if it hadn't succeeded. Later that morning, Lily called. Her voice was hesitant, cautious in a way that didn't belong to someone her age. She asked how I was feeling, not how Marissa was, not what the doctors said, but me. I told her the truth, that I felt fine, that I was thinking. She exhaled softly as if she'd been holding her breath. We didn't talk long. She didn't need explanations. She needed reassurance that what she had seen, what she had sensed, wasn't imaginary. Before we hung up, she said something that stayed with me all day. I thought it was just me, she said, but it didn't feel right. By noon, I knew what I had to do next. Not dramatically, not publicly, but thoroughly. I gathered papers from a drawer I hadn't opened in months. Old insurance forms, bank statements, documents Caleb had brought by just to simplify things. At the time, I'd signed because it was easier than asking questions, because trust had always seemed safer than suspicion. I read every page now slowly, carefully. Words that once seemed harmless took on new weight. Authority, authorization, durable, temporary. Each one carried implications I hadn't been meant to linger on. There it was, a power of attorney. Broad enough to be useful, vague enough to be dangerous. My signature sat at the bottom, familiar and unsettling. I felt no panic, only clarity. This wasn't about a single dinner or a single choice. It was a pattern laid carefully over time, relying on my willingness to assume good intentions. I called Grace that afternoon. She had been my attorney for years, not because I needed constant legal advice, but because I valued having someone who spoke precisely and listened closely. When she answered, I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I told her I needed to see her. Immediately, she didn't ask questions. She gave me a time. Her office was quiet, orderly, the kind of place where nothing felt rushed or overlooked. I placed the documents on her desk, along with the jar wrapped carefully in a towel. She raised an eyebrow at that but said nothing until she had read everything twice. When she finally looked up, her expression was calm but firm. "You're not imagining this," she said, "and you're not overreacting." Those words mattered more than anything else she could have said. She explained my options without dramatics: revoking authority, securing accounts, creating distance where access had been assumed. She spoke in facts, not fear. I listened, asked questions, and answered hers honestly. When she asked if Caleb knew how much control he'd been given, I told her I didn't think he believed I'd ever question it. Grace nodded. "That's often how this works," she said. "People don't count on resistance, they count on silence." By the time I left her office, the sun was already lowering, the day slipping quietly toward evening. I felt tired but not drained. There's a difference. One is exhaustion, the other is the weight of responsibility finally being carried where it belongs. That night, Caleb called. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. When he called again, I answered. He asked about Marissa. He asked if I'd heard anything from the hospital. He did not ask why I'd left early or how I'd felt watching the ambulance pull away. I told him I hoped she was recovering. I told him I was busy. When he asked what I'd been doing, I said I'd been taking care of things. He paused just long enough to register discomfort. "We can talk later," he said. "Of course," I replied. And I meant it, just not on his terms. After the call, I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink, watching the light fade from the yard. I thought about how many times I'd been told I was lucky to have a son who cared so much. How often Marissa had framed decisions as help, oversight as concern. I thought about how easily people mistake politeness for goodness, composure for compliance. I slept that night deeply and without interruption. Not because things were resolved, but because they were finally named. In the morning, I moved the jar from the counter to a locked drawer, not as evidence yet, but as acknowledgement. Some truths need to be preserved until the right moment arrives. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Caleb sent messages checking in, offering help, suggesting I rest. Marissa sent one carefully worded note about misunderstandings and stress and family coming together. I read it once and didn't respond. Silence, I had learned, is not absence. It's a boundary. Lily stopped by midweek. She sat at the kitchen table, twisting the sleeve of her sweater, eyes darting toward the window whenever a car passed. I didn't ask her questions. I let her speak when she was ready. She told me about overheard conversations, about how concern was always discussed as strategy, never as feeling. When she finished, I thanked her, not for choosing sides, but for choosing honesty. She looked relieved, like someone finally believed her. That evening, I made another decision. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I simply acted. Some choices don't require witnesses. They require resolve. By the end of the week, everything that needed protecting was protected. Everything that needed clarifying had been clarified, at least on paper. What remained was the human part, the unpredictable part. The part that would test whether control disguised as care could survive being seen for what it was. As I turned off the lights that night, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not fear, certainty, the kind that doesn't need validation. The kind that waits patiently, knowing the truth has a way of revealing itself when given enough room to breathe. People like to believe that once something is named, it loses its power. That once you see a pattern clearly, it stops affecting you. I learned quickly that clarity doesn't erase tension, it sharpens it. The days after my meeting with Grace were filled with a quiet pressure, like the air before a storm that refuses to break. Nothing dramatic happened at first, and that was exactly what unsettled me. Silence, when it follows resistance, is rarely peaceful. Caleb started coming by more often, not unannounced, not forcefully, but with careful courtesy. He would text first, asking if I needed anything, if I was feeling all right, if I'd eaten. On the surface, it was concern. Underneath, it felt like inventory. Each visit followed the same rhythm. He'd sit at the kitchen table, glance around as if checking for changes, and talk about neutral things, work, traffic, how tired Marissa had been since Thanksgiving. He avoided specifics, avoided the dinner, avoided the moment everything shifted. I let him talk. Listening, I realized, gives people enough rope to reveal themselves. Marissa didn't come with him at first. When she did, she stayed near the doorway, handbag still on her arm, posture polite but guarded. She spoke softly, asked how I was sleeping, commented on how well I looked. Compliments that landed like assessments. She never sat down, she never stayed long. It was as if she needed to see me upright, coherent, unchanged, and then leave before that image contradicted whatever narrative was forming elsewhere. One afternoon, after they left, I noticed a folder on the counter that hadn't been there before. It contained copies of documents I recognized immediately: bank summaries, insurance statements. Not originals, but enough to suggest preparation. I didn't confront him. I didn't call. I simply placed the folder in a drawer beside the jar and made a note of the date. Awareness is most effective when it's quiet. Lily came by again that weekend. This time she was less hesitant. She sat across from me, elbows on the table, eyes steady. "They're saying you're overwhelmed," she told me, "that you've been stressed for a while. That maybe you're not thinking clearly." She said it without drama, without accusation, just information. I thanked her and poured us both tea. She watched me carefully as if measuring my response. When I didn't react, she exhaled. "I knew it," she said. "I knew it wasn't just me." That was the moment I understood how far this had already gone. Concern had become conversation. Conversation was becoming groundwork. I thought about how often authority is built quietly, how easily perception can be shaped if no one interrupts it early enough. I also thought about how many people never realize it's happening until decisions are made without them. That evening, I reviewed everything again, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted to be thorough. I cross-checked dates, matched signatures, made copies. Grace had warned me that the next phase, if it came, wouldn't be emotional. It would be procedural. That's where people like Caleb felt most comfortable: paperwork, process, plausible concern. When Caleb called later that night, his voice sounded rehearsed. He said Marissa was worried about me. He said Lily was confused. He said maybe we should all sit down together, clear the air. I told him I was open to a conversation, but not a meeting. Not yet. He paused, then agreed too quickly. That told me more than anything else. 2 days later, Grace called. She'd finished securing everything. Accounts locked, authority revoked, instructions documented. "You're protected," she said. Legally, I thanked her and asked the question that had been circling my thoughts for days. "What happens if they push back?" She didn't hesitate. "Then they reveal intent," she replied. "And intent changes everything." The pushback came quietly. A call from a social services office framed as a routine wellness check. Polite, non-accusatory. They said a family member had expressed concern. I agreed to speak with them, scheduled a time, and informed Grace immediately. Transparency, she'd said, is disarming. I wasn't afraid of the conversation. I was curious about how it would unfold. When the call came, I answered calmly. I described my daily routines, my support system, my finances. I answered every question without rushing, without defensiveness. When asked about Thanksgiving, I stated facts only, no speculation, no emotion. By the end of the call, the tone had shifted. What began as concern ended as documentation. They thanked me for my time. I thanked them for theirs. When we hung up, I knew something important had happened. The narrative had lost momentum. That night, Lily texted me. "Dad's upset," she wrote. "He says you embarrassed him." I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I replied, "Truth often feels that way to people who expected silence." She didn't respond immediately, but when she did, it was a simple heart emoji. That was enough. Marissa finally called the next morning. Her voice was gentle, measured. She said she felt things had gotten out of hand. She said stress makes people misinterpret intentions. She said family should support one another, not involve outsiders. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "Care doesn't require control." There was a pause. "I never tried to control you," she replied. "I know," I said. And that ended the call. By the end of the week, the atmosphere had changed. The visits stopped. The messages slowed. Silence returned, but this time it felt different, not watchful, not strategic. It felt like retreat. I didn't celebrate it, I noted it. I spent that weekend doing ordinary things, cleaning out a closet, replanting herbs on the windowsill, walking Lily to the bus stop when she stayed over one night. Small acts that grounded me in the present. Strength, I was learning, isn't built through confrontation alone. It's built through continuity, showing up as yourself even when others expect you to shrink. On Sunday evening, as I locked the doors and turned off the lights, I thought about how quickly roles can reverse. How easily a mother can become an obstacle, a concern, a problem to manage. I also thought about how instinct doesn't shout, it whispers. And if you listen early enough, it saves you from having to scream later. Whatever came next, I was ready. Not because I felt powerful, but because I felt anchored. And when you're anchored, manipulation has nothing to pull against. By the time the wellness call ended and the silence settled back into my home, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. When control fails quietly, it doesn't disappear. It changes tactics. The absence of calls and visits wasn't peace. It was recalculation. I noticed it first in small, almost forgettable ways. A neighbor mentioned seeing Caleb's car drive slowly past my house one afternoon without stopping. A flyer appeared on my porch for a senior support seminar, neatly placed, not tossed, the kind of thing meant to look helpful rather than intrusive. I threw it away without reading it. People who truly want to help don't leave breadcrumbs, they show up honestly. Marissa sent a message midweek. It was polite, carefully worded, the kind of text that could be shown to anyone without embarrassment. She wrote that she hoped I was feeling better, that stress affects everyone differently, that families sometimes misunderstand one another during emotional times. She suggested we reset and move forward without involving lawyers or outside parties. I read it twice, then once more, paying attention not to what was said, but to what wasn't. There was no acknowledgement of boundaries crossed, no apology, only an invitation to return to the version of things where my compliance was assumed. I didn't respond. Grace called later that afternoon. She had a habit of speaking only when there was something worth saying. "They're trying to reframe," she told me. "That's common when initial pressure doesn't work. If they can't move you directly, they'll try to make your resistance look unnecessary." I asked her what she advised. "Stay consistent," she said. "Consistency is difficult to argue with." That night, Lily stayed over. She sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, shoulders tense, as if bracing for impact even in a place that had never harmed her. Eventually, she looked up and said, "They're saying you're being influenced." The word hung between us. Influenced, as if I were a surface waiting for an imprint. I asked her what she thought. She shrugged. "I think they're upset they don't get to decide anymore." There was no anger in her voice, just observation. We talked late into the evening, not about the situation directly, but about school, about the pressure to always appear agreeable, about how often young women are taught that peace means silence. I listened more than I spoke. It occurred to me that whatever Caleb and Marissa were attempting, it wasn't just about me. It was about maintaining a structure where authority flowed in one direction. Lily saw that. That mattered. The next morning, I received a formal letter. It was addressed correctly, printed on clean stationery, and written in language designed to sound neutral. It stated that concerns had been raised regarding my recent decisions and that a review of my circumstances might be necessary to ensure my well-being. It didn't accuse, it implied. That distinction was deliberate. I read it calmly, then placed it beside the jar in the refrigerator where evidence and intention sat quietly together. Grace reviewed the letter that afternoon. "They're testing the ground," she said, "seeing if you'll react emotionally." I didn't feel emotional. I felt resolved. We drafted a brief response, factual and restrained, reaffirming my capacity and my choices. It didn't argue. It documented. When it was sent, I felt no relief, only steadiness. Caleb called that evening. His voice was softer than usual, almost tentative. He asked how I was feeling. He said Marissa was worried. He said Lily seemed distant. He said maybe everything had gone too far. I told him I was well. I told him I was clear. When he suggested that we meet privately, just the two of us, I declined. There's nothing to clarify, I said. He was quiet for a moment, then said he hoped I understood how difficult this was for him. I replied, I understand difficulty, I don't accept manipulation. The line went silent. After that, the pressure intensified briefly, then dissipated. Another letter arrived, this one more cautious. A call came from a mediator suggesting family dialogue. I declined again, politely, firmly. Each refusal felt less like resistance and more like alignment. I wasn't pushing against them anymore. I was standing with myself. One afternoon, as I watered the plants by the window, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked the same as always, but something in my posture had shifted. I was no longer bracing. I was occupying my own space fully. That realization surprised me. I hadn't known how much room I'd been leaving for others until I stopped. Lily came by after school the next day, eyes bright with something between relief and pride. They're angry, she said. But they've stopped trying to explain you. I understood what she meant. When people can no longer control the story, they often abandon it. That abandonment is revealing. That evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the house quiet in a way that felt earned. I thought about how authority is often mistaken for volume, for insistence, for presence. In truth, authority lives in clarity. It doesn't need to repeat itself, it simply remains. Whatever Caleb and Marissa believed they were entitled to, it no longer included my compliance. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt certain that they knew it too. The first real fracture came quietly, not with confrontation, but with paperwork. It arrived in a plain envelope one Tuesday morning, mixed in with utility bills and grocery flyers. No return address. Just my name printed neatly across the front, as if whoever sent it wanted to appear harmless. Inside was a copy of a document I recognized immediately, not because I remembered signing it clearly, but because I remembered how rushed I'd felt when I did. The heading read Durable Power of Attorney. Caleb's name appeared in 3 separate places. Mine appeared once, at the bottom, in a version of my handwriting that looked unfamiliar even to me. I sat at the kitchen table longer than I needed to, reading the pages slowly, deliberately. According to this document, my son had the authority to make financial decisions on my behalf if I were deemed unable to do so myself. The language was clean, professional, reassuring. It spoke of protection, continuity, care. What it did not mention was consent given with full understanding. I remembered the afternoon he'd brought it over. He'd stood in the doorway, smiling, saying it was just a precaution. Everyone our age is doing it for their parents, he'd said. Marissa had nodded beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I trusted that gesture more than the words. I always had. Now, looking at the document again, I understood why my instincts had been so unsettled at Thanksgiving. That dinner hadn't been an isolated moment. It had been part of a pattern, one I'd ignored because it arrived wrapped in politeness. I folded the pages carefully and placed them back into the envelope. Then I made coffee and sat by the window until the mug cooled in my hands. Fear would have been easier, anger would have been simpler. What I felt instead was resolve. I called Grace before noon. She answered on the second ring, her voice steady as it always was. We'd worked together for years, not just as attorney and client, but as 2 women who understood that preparedness was not pessimism. I told her everything without dramatizing it. The dinner, the plate, the document, the timing. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor," she said finally, "I want you to come in today." Her office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. When I handed her the document, she read it carefully, adjusting her glasses, marking sections with a pen she didn't yet use. "You're not incapacitated," she said calmly. "You're observant. And someone underestimated that?" She explained my options plainly. The power of attorney could be revoked immediately. My assets could be restructured. Access could be restricted. Boundaries could be made enforceable. None of it required confrontation, only clarity. By the time I left her office, the afternoon sun had shifted, stretching long shadows across the sidewalk. I felt lighter not because the problem was solved, but because it was named. That evening, Lily came by. She let herself in the way she always had, calling out softly before stepping into the kitchen. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying too much awareness at a young age. We sat together without rushing. I didn't ask questions at first, I waited. "Grandma," she said eventually, staring into her tea, "they're saying you've been confused lately." The words landed quietly, but they landed hard. I didn't react. I asked where she'd heard that. She told me carefully that she'd overheard conversations. That Marissa used phrases like forgetful and slipping, that Caleb never corrected her, that they spoke as if concern was already a conclusion. "That's why I called you," Lily said. "Something felt wrong." I reached across the table and took her hand. "You did the right thing," I told her, and meant it more deeply than she could know. In that moment, I understood something crucial. The problem wasn't just control, it was narrative. They were preparing a version of me that made their actions reasonable. Over the next week, small things began to shift. Bank notifications arrived asking to confirm changes I hadn't requested. A prescription refill was delayed because someone else had called on my behalf. A neighbor mentioned that Marissa had asked whether I was managing well on my own. Each moment alone could be dismissed. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Grace moved quickly, accounts were secured, authorizations revoked, documentation updated. Everything was done properly, quietly, with no accusations, just action. Caleb noticed almost immediately. He called one afternoon, his voice carefully casual. "Hey Mom, just checking in." "Everything okay?" "Everything was fine," I told him, because it was. For the first time in a long while, it truly was. He hesitated, then asked about the bank. I told him Grace was handling some updates. He went quiet, not angry. Not confused, calculating. Marissa didn't call at all. Instead, a letter arrived. Legal language, measured and impersonal, suggesting concern about my well-being and offering assistance during a potentially difficult transition. Grace smiled when she read it. "They're testing," she said, "and they're late." That night I slept without replaying conversations, without bracing for the next moment. The quiet felt earned. What surprised me most was not their reaction, but my own. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel. I felt aligned. For years, I had believed that being a good mother meant absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to. I understood now how easily that belief could be used against me. Boundaries were not abandonment. They were definition. As I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, I thought about Thanksgiving again, about how close I'd come to ignoring myself, about how different everything might have been if I had. Some storms announce themselves loudly. Others begin with a smile, a document, a suggestion framed as care. The difference is whether you notice in time. I had, and this time I wasn't stepping aside. The shift from quiet maneuvering to open resistance didn't happen all at once. It arrived the way pressure always does, incremental, testing, probing for weakness. It began with a visit I hadn't invited. I was folding laundry mid-morning when the doorbell rang. Not the soft press Lily used, but a firm, deliberate ring. Through the glass, I saw Caleb standing on the porch, shoulders squared, posture polite in a way that suggested preparation. Marissa was not with him. That absence mattered. I opened the door without hesitation. "Mom," he said, smiling, though his eyes moved past me, scanning the house the way someone does when they're looking for confirmation. I was in the neighborhood. I stepped aside and let him in, not because he deserved entry, but because I was done avoiding conversations I hadn't started. He sat at the kitchen table, exactly where he always had, hands folded, back straight. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, the sound carefully measured. "I've been getting some concerning feedback," he began. "From the bank, from Marissa, from people who care about you." I poured coffee for myself, not offering him any. "Concern travels quickly," I said. "Facts take longer." He frowned slightly. "That's not fair." "No," I replied calmly, sitting across from him. "It's accurate." He shifted, leaning forward. "Mom, no one is trying to control you. We're worried you've been distant, making changes without talking to us. That's not like you." I met his eyes steadily. "It is like me, you're just not used to seeing it." His jaw tightened. "Marissa thinks you're acting out of fear." I almost smiled. "Marissa is welcome to her thoughts. She is not welcome to my authority." That landed harder than he expected. He paused, recalibrating. "We just want to help," he said. "You don't need to make everything so formal, lawyers, documents. It feels extreme." "Extreme," I repeated softly. is assuming I wouldn't notice. Silence filled the space between us. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed, oblivious to the shift taking place inside this room. You revoked the power of attorney, he said finally. Yes. You didn't tell me. I didn't need permission. His voice sharpened. That document was for your protection? It was for your access. He stood abruptly, pushing his chair back. You're being unfair. I remained seated. Sit down, Caleb. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. He hesitated, then sat. I raised you, I continued. I know the difference between care and convenience, between concern and leverage, and I know when I'm being repositioned. His eyes flicked away. That was answer enough. I'm not accusing you, I said. I'm informing you. From now on, decisions about my life will not be filtered through your comfort. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Marissa won't take this well. That is not my responsibility. He left shortly after, his goodbye clipped, restrained. As the door closed, I felt no triumph, only confirmation. The escalation came 2 days later. Grace called just after noon. Eleanor, she said, voice calm but precise, Adult Protective Services received an inquiry about you this morning. I closed my eyes briefly. From family, yes. What happens next? They'll likely request a wellness check. Routine, I'll handle the paperwork. I expected this, I said. I know, she replied. That's why you're protected. The knock came the following afternoon. 2 women stood at my door, polite, professional. They explained the purpose of their visit, their tone neutral. I invited them in, offered seats, answered every question clearly and patiently. Did I manage my finances independently? Yes. Did I prepare my own meals? Yes. Did I feel safe in my home? Yes. They took notes, they observed, they listened. When they left, one of them paused. You seem very capable, she said gently. I am, I replied. That evening Lily called. They're saying you're angry, she said quietly, that you've been influenced. By whom? She hesitated. By yourself. I smiled. That's the first honest accusation they've made. She laughed softly, then grew serious. They're not going to stop, are they? No, I said. But neither am I. What followed was a week of controlled chaos. Emails from Marissa framed as concern, calls from Caleb that stopped just short of confrontation. Subtle suggestions made to neighbors, all of it carefully crafted to suggest instability without ever stating it outright. Grace documented everything. You're doing exactly what you should, she assured me. Consistency is your strongest defense. And she was right. I didn't explain myself. I didn't argue. I lived visibly, steadily. I drove my car. I attended my book group. I paid my bills in person. I let nothing appear hidden or rushed. Control, I'd learned, dissolves when it's exposed to routine. One afternoon, I found Lily sitting on my porch steps when I returned home. Her shoulders were tense, her expression conflicted. I heard them talking, she said as soon as I sat beside her. They're trying to figure out how to make it official. Guardianship. They think if they push hard enough, you'll get tired. I placed a hand over hers. Thank you for telling me. Are you scared? I considered the question honestly. No, I'm focused. That night I slept deeply, not because the threat had passed, but because I understood it. Power doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives with a clipboard, a signature, a smile that insists it knows better than you do. But power also leaves quietly when it's denied access. By the end of the week, the calls slowed. The emails became shorter. The tone shifted from certainty to irritation. They were running out of angles, and I was still standing. I stood at my kitchen window one morning, watching sunlight spill across the floor, and felt something settle inside me. Not relief. Not victory, ownership. Whatever came next, it would meet someone who had already reclaimed herself, and that made all the difference. What surprised me most wasn't how quickly things escalated, but how quietly they unraveled afterward. Once people realize they can no longer move you, they rarely confront you head-on. They circle, they wait. They test whether silence will make you uncomfortable enough to step back into the role you've always played. I didn't. The days that followed settled into a strange calm. No new messages from Marissa. No just checking in calls from Caleb. The absence felt intentional, like a pause meant to provoke doubt. I recognized it for what it was. Distance used as pressure. I filled that distance with routine. I woke early, made coffee, read the paper cover to cover. I took walks without explaining where I was going. I reorganized a closet I'd avoided for years, discarding things I'd kept out of habit rather than need. Each small decision carried a quiet satisfaction. Autonomy doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through ordinary moments done without negotiation. Grace called midweek to update me. "The inquiry has been closed," she said simply. "No further action recommended." I thanked her not with relief but with confirmation. The system had looked at me, truly looked, and found nothing fragile to exploit. "That doesn't mean they're finished trying," she added. "I know," I said, "but I am finished responding." That afternoon, I found a note tucked into my mailbox. Caleb's handwriting. Careful, restrained, "Can we talk? Just us. No lawyers." I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it on the hall table. Not to answer immediately, not to reject it outright. I wanted to consider what talking meant now that I no longer needed to defend myself. I agreed to meet him 2 days later in a public cafe near the park. Neutral ground, no home advantage, no witnesses we knew. He arrived early, already seated, hands wrapped around a coffee he wasn't drinking. When he saw me, he stood, unsure whether to hug me or not. I let him decide. He chose distance. "You look well," he said. "I am," I replied. We sat. For a moment, the sounds of the cafe filled the space between us. Cups clinking, someone laughing too loudly, life going on without regard for our tension. "I didn't realize how far things had gone," he said finally. "That's rarely the case," I answered. "People don't notice shifts when they benefit from them." He flinched but didn't argue. "Marissa feels like she's being painted as a villain," he said. "Marissa painted herself by how she behaved," I replied evenly. "I didn't add color," he sighed. "She thought she was helping, keeping things organized, making sure nothing slipped." "Control often disguises itself as organization," I said. "Especially when directed at someone assumed to be fading." That landed. I saw it in his eyes, not guilt exactly, recognition. "I stayed neutral because I thought it would keep peace," he said quietly. "Neutrality," I said, "only protects the person applying pressure. It never protects the person absorbing it." He nodded slowly, as if turning the words over, testing their weight. "Do you think this can go back to how it was?" he asked. "No," I said without hesitation, "and it shouldn't." He looked down at his hands. "Then what does it become?" "That depends on whether you're willing to know me as I am now," I said. "Not as someone you manage. Not as someone you speak for." Silence followed, not awkward, necessary. When we parted, there were no promises made, no resolutions declared. And that felt honest. Rebuilding something requires truth first, not urgency. In the weeks that followed, I noticed changes, subtle ones. Caleb began asking instead of assuming, short messages, neutral updates, no instructions hidden inside concern. Marissa remained distant, her silence more telling than any apology might have been. I didn't chase it. Lily, however, came by often, sometimes to talk, sometimes just to sit quietly while she did her homework. She didn't ask me to explain myself, she watched, and I could tell she was learning something she hadn't known how to name before. One evening, as we washed dishes together, she said, "They're not sure what to do with you anymore." I smiled faintly. "That's not a bad place for them to be," she grinned. "I think you scared them." "No," I corrected gently, "I surprised them." There's a difference. Fear fades, surprise lingers, autumn deepened. The house grew quieter, not from absence but from peace. I no longer braced myself before phone calls. I no longer replayed conversations searching for what I might have said differently. The constant internal negotiation had ended. I realized something important during that time. I had spent years believing that maintaining connection required softening myself. That love meant accommodating discomfort. That silence was the price of belonging. I had been wrong. Belonging that requires your erasure isn't belonging, it's convenience. By choosing clarity over comfort, I hadn't lost my family. I had redefined the terms under which I would participate in it. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror and paused. My posture looked different. Not defensive, not apologetic, simply present. I looked like someone who expected to be taken seriously. That mattered. As winter approached, I prepared the house without thinking about who might object or interfere. I changed locks, updated paperwork. Not out of fear, but out of order. I put things where they belonged, inside and out. And when I turned off the lights each night, I didn't feel lonely. I felt complete. Whatever came next would meet someone no longer negotiating her place. And that, I knew, was something no one could undo. The resolution didn't arrive with an apology or a confession. It arrived with quiet permanence. By the time winter fully settled in, I understood something I hadn't before. Closure is not something another person gives you. It's something you claim when you stop waiting for permission to move forward. The house felt different now, not emptier, not fuller settled. I noticed it most in the mornings. I no longer woke with a low hum of anticipation, bracing for interruption. There were no unannounced visits, no messages framed as concern that carried instructions beneath them. When the phone rang, it was because someone wanted to hear my voice, not because they needed something explained, fixed, or signed. Grace stopped by one afternoon to finalize the last of the legal updates. She didn't linger, she never did. Efficiency was her version of care. "Everything is clean," she said, sliding the folder across the table. "No overlapping authority, no ambiguity." "Good," I replied. She studied me for a moment before standing. "Most people wait too long to do this," she said. "They wait until something breaks." "I waited until I saw clearly," I answered. She smiled once, sharp and approving. "That's earlier than most." After she left, I put the folder away and didn't think about it again. Paperwork had served its purpose. It had given structure to what I already knew, but it wasn't the heart of what had changed. What had changed was me. Caleb reached out occasionally, short updates, neutral check-ins. He no longer spoke as if he were managing something fragile. When he asked questions, he waited for answers. When he offered opinions, he didn't insist. We were learning each other again, not as parent and child frozen in old roles, but as adults navigating new ground. Marissa remained distant. I didn't interpret that as loss. Some relationships don't dissolve, they simply stop demanding space. I respected the distance. It felt mutual. Lily, however, stayed close. She came by with school projects, with questions about the past, about her grandfather, about the version of family she was trying to understand without inheriting its mistakes. I answered honestly but carefully. I didn't want to pass on bitterness disguised as wisdom. One evening, while we sat together sorting old photographs, she paused over a picture of me holding Caleb as a toddler. "You look so sure," she said. "I was," I replied. "I just forgot for a while." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. That was the thing, strength doesn't disappear, it waits. Sometimes patiently, sometimes quietly. But it's always there, ready to return the moment you stop pretending not to hear it. The memory of Thanksgiving no longer carried sharp edges. It had become a marker, not a wound. A moment when instinct spoke clearly and I listened. A reminder that awareness often arrives before explanation. I never confronted Caleb directly about that night. I didn't need to. The truth had already rearranged everything. Accountability doesn't always require confession. Sometimes it shows itself in changed behavior, in caution replacing confidence, in silence where entitlement once lived. As spring approached, I opened the windows and let fresh air move through rooms that had held too much tension for too long. I donated what I didn't need, rearranged furniture simply because I could. I planted herbs along the back fence, my hands deep in the soil, grounding myself in something honest and uncomplicated. Neighbors noticed the changes. They commented on how peaceful the house felt. I smiled and agreed without explanation. Peace doesn't need a backstory. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, I thought about how easily people mistake restraint for weakness. How often quiet people are assumed to be passive. How dangerous that assumption can be. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused. I hadn't demanded apologies. I had simply made one decision after another, calmly and without spectacle, until the balance of power shifted. That's the thing about dignity. It doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. When I locked the door each night, it wasn't to keep anyone out. It was to mark what was mine to protect. My time, my choices, my sense of self. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. And that alignment changed everything. I had trusted my instincts when it mattered most. I had honored them afterward. I had chosen clarity over comfort, truth over tradition, and myself over the expectation that I should always make things easier for others at my own expense. Family holidays would come and go, tables would be set, conversations would shift. Life would continue as it always does, but I would continue differently, not smaller, not quieter, just clearer. And once you learn the sound of your own certainty, You never confuse it with politeness again.